My name is Letitia, and I was 33 years old the night my younger sister tried to erase me from my own life by announcing she was pregnant with my ex-fiance's child and calmly suggesting I leave the house so they could start a family. I didn't throw the wine glass in my hand, though I wanted to. I didn't scream, cry, or cause a scene. I just stared at her. Across the dinner table, her hands resting over her stomach, her eyes full of self-congratulation, and let the silence stretch so long it started to eat the air around us. That was the moment everything clicked. Every strange glance between them, every lingering moment in the hallway, every excuse that never made sense. It all came crashing into focus like a mirror finally shattering under pressure. But before I take you into the rest of this story, before you see what happened when I stopped being quiet and started reclaiming what was mine, I need to ask something of you. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you thought would protect you, if you've ever watched someone try to replace you in your own home, then please, hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one. And make sure you subscribe to this channel because what comes next isn't just betrayal, it's war. Looking back, I think part of me always knew my sister would do something like this. Her name is Mariana, and she's 3 years younger than me. To most people, she comes off charming, bubbly, magnetic, the kind of girl who walks into a room and effortlessly becomes the center of it. But to those of us who really know her, there's something else beneath the shine. Something hungry. I was never allowed to shine when she was around, not without her needing to outshine me. When I graduated with honors, she showed up late to the ceremony wearing a white dress and full glam makeup. When I got my first promotion, she staged a dramatic breakup and cried through dinner with our parents. And when I got engaged to Elias, my best friend, my partner, the man I believed would grow old with me, she didn't congratulate me. She just smiled, that same tight smile I had seen since we were girls, the one that meant she had already decided what she was going to take from me next. What she didn't know, or maybe forgot, was that I had quietly spent years building something she couldn't touch. The house I lived in, left to me by my aunt, the only family member who ever truly understood me. I had renovated it, room by room, on my own. I had hosted holidays in that kitchen, made plans for children in that garden, imagined growing old in that living room with Elias by my side. It was more than a home. It was the only place that ever felt like mine. When Mariana called crying one night, broke, alone, recently dumped, and asked if she could stay for just a little while, I hesitated. Every bone in my body warned me not to say yes. But I did. Because sometimes family guilt is louder than instincts, and because I still believed deep down that maybe she could change. For weeks, she floated through my home like smoke, filling corners I hadn't invited her into. She left her clothes in the bathroom, her makeup in the hallway, her scent in the sheets of the guest bed. Elias said I was being dramatic. He told me she was just adjusting. But it wasn't just that. She was adjusting me out of my own life, and I let her, until the night of that dinner, when she placed one hand on her stomach and told my parents they were going to be grandparents. When she turned to me, eyes glinting with that same old hunger, and explained how it just made sense for her and Elias to have the master bedroom, for me to move out, for them to raise their child in my home. She thought I would break. She thought I would fall to pieces, or leave, or beg. But what she didn't know was that I had already broken in silence. And now, I was done breaking. Because I held something stronger than their betrayal. I held the title deed. I always thought that by being the responsible one, I was somehow protecting myself. That if I did everything right, followed the rules, held my tongue, cleaned up after other people's messes, life would reward me with stability, maybe even peace. But the truth is, being the dependable one doesn't make you untouchable. It just makes you easier to use. Growing up with Mariana was like living beside a bonfire, beautiful to look at, but dangerous if you got too close. She was the kind of child who could destroy something and then convince everyone she was the victim. I, on the other hand, was the cleanup crew. I was the older sister, the one who got the blame when things went wrong, the one expected to know better, to be better. It didn't matter if she lied, manipulated, or threw tantrums. The moment our parents turned to me, I was always the one who had to apologize first. Somewhere along the way, I stopped expecting fairness. The only place I ever felt safe was in the home of my aunt, a woman who saw right through Mariana's tricks and treated me as if my quiet, steady nature was something to be proud of. Her house, the house that would later become mine, was where I learned how to breathe. I spent countless weekends there growing up, reading in silence, planting things that actually stayed alive, eating food that didn't come with strings attached. It was in that house I first understood what it felt like to be wanted without performance. I never thought I'd inherit it. When she passed away, I had prepared myself for disappointment, assuming it would be sold and the money divided. But she had seen me. She had noticed. In her will, she left me the house explicitly, thanking me for the years I had spent by her side, helping with errands and appointments, just being present. It was the first time in my life I had been chosen. It became my anchor. By the time I met Elias, I had been living there for nearly 3 years. I was working full-time, saving responsibly, slowly transforming the house into something that felt like an extension of myself. When he came into my life, I let him in with careful optimism. He was different, I told myself, calmer, grounded. He noticed the little things, the way I lined up my books, the stories behind every piece of mismatched furniture. He said he loved the history in the walls, the warmth of the space. And for a while I believed we were building something real. We made plans. We imagined children. We painted the hallway a soft gray together and talked about keeping the garden alive for future generations. He said the house felt like home. I let that word sink in, not realizing how fragile it was in his mouth. When Mariana called and asked to stay, everything inside me screamed no. I remembered the way she had a habit of making herself too comfortable in other people's lives. But guilt has a way of overriding logic, especially when it wears the mask of family. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I had boundaries this time. I told myself she would never cross a line like that again. She arrived 2 days later with 3 oversized suitcases and a strained smile. From the start, she moved as though she already owned the space. Her things were everywhere. Her perfume lingered in the hallway long after she passed through it. She took long showers and left the bathroom fogged and cluttered, as if someone else would come clean it for her. And Elias, he said I was being harsh. He said she was just going through a lot. What I saw, he chose not to see. She was in the kitchen more often than I was. She made his favorite meals without asking. She claimed she wanted to help, but everything felt like a performance. Slowly, the photos on the wall started shifting. My things disappeared and reappeared in strange places. The house, once a reflection of me, began to look like something else, something unfamiliar. The worst part wasn't what I saw, it was what I felt. The growing tension in my chest, the way I started walking quieter, shrinking myself, trying not to make waves in my own home. I began avoiding rooms when they were alone together. I started staying late at work, taking longer drives home, delaying the moment I'd have to step back into a space that no longer felt like mine. Every time I confronted my own discomfort, I second-guessed it. Was I being possessive, unfair, paranoid? After all, he had chosen me. We were planning a life. But love doesn't always prevent betrayal. Sometimes it just makes it more painful. There's a special kind of cruelty in watching someone slowly chip away at the life you built. especially when that person was once your sister and the man helping her used to say he loved you. By the time the pregnancy was announced, I was already a ghost in my own story. They didn't break me in one violent act. They wore me down piece by piece until I couldn't recognize the life I was supposed to be living. But that night, something snapped back into place. Something cold and sharp and clear. I realized they had been writing over me for months, but they forgot I still held the pen. When I first moved into the house, it felt like stepping into peace. Every corner was filled with the quiet weight of history, of people who had once lived gently within its walls. I remember the first night I slept there alone, lying in bed and hearing nothing but the sound of wind through the trees. It was the first place that didn't demand anything from me. It simply let me exist. I spent months turning it into something that reflected me, sanding old wood floors, repainting cracked walls, replacing worn light fixtures one by one. I learned how to strip wallpaper, how to unclog a drain, how to plant tomatoes and keep them alive. Each improvement felt like claiming a piece of myself. Each small change brought comfort. It became more than shelter. It became an extension of my identity. But when Mariana moved in, the air shifted. At first, it was subtle. I dismissed it as temporary discomfort, the friction of two adult women adjusting to a shared space. I tried to make it easier, giving her closet space, letting her choose the color of the guest room curtains, pretending I didn't notice when my face cream ran out twice as fast or my favorite sweater appeared in the laundry stretched beyond recognition. But slowly, the subtle became suffocating. She began leaving things around the house like breadcrumbs marking her territory. Shoes by the door, makeup on the kitchen counter, damp towels draped over chairs instead of returned to the bathroom. She took over the living room most nights, watching shows I never liked, volume just high enough to make silence impossible. I started retreating to my bedroom earlier, just to have one corner left untouched. Elias didn't seem to notice the shift, or maybe he did and just didn't care. He said she was adjusting, that we needed to give her time. He never saw the tension in my jaw or the way I hesitated before walking through my own front door. He didn't notice when I stopped cooking, when I started sleeping with my back turned, when I began collecting small, strange moments like puzzle pieces that didn't quite form a picture. Not yet, but soon. I caught her in my bedroom once. She said she was borrowing earrings. My jewelry box was open, my ring placed neatly beside it as if she'd tried it on and thought twice. Or maybe she didn't think twice at all. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the imprint her presence had left on my carpet, the shadow of someone who didn't belong. I tried to convince myself it wasn't intentional, that she wasn't trying to invade, that she wasn't testing how far she could go before I snapped. But that's the thing about patterns. If you've lived them long enough, you start to recognize the rhythm even in silence. She had always pushed boundaries, always rewritten the rules as she went, always played the victim when challenged. And I had always backed down, choosing peace over pride. Until now, the worst moments weren't the obvious ones. They were the quiet humiliations. Like the way my friends started texting me less because she answered the door with a laugh and said I was busy. Or how Elias started spending more time downstairs after I'd gone to bed, saying he was catching up on work while her voice echoed faintly from the living room. The house felt colder even when the heat was on. The walls, once warm and familiar, now seemed to absorb my unease. I began waking up with headaches, grinding my teeth through sleep. I avoided mirrors because I didn't recognize the dull eyes staring back at me. I was disappearing in the one place I had built to feel seen. And through it all, Mariana flourished. She wore my clothes, cooked my meals, sat in my chairs, used my shampoo, laughed with my fiancé. She didn't take over my house in a single bold move. She occupied it the way mold creeps through a wall, quietly, invisibly, until one day you realize the structure beneath is rotting. She started rearranging things. Furniture shifted without warning. Family photos were moved, some taken down. I found one of my framed pictures in a kitchen drawer beneath a stack of takeout menus. I told myself it was an accident. I lied to myself a lot during those days. I told myself she was struggling, that she didn't mean harm, that I was being overly sensitive. But deep down, I knew. There was a moment, an ordinary Tuesday evening, when I came home to find her wearing one of my old university shirts and cooking dinner in my kitchen. Elias stood beside her, stirring a pot, laughing at something she said. It was the image that broke me, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was so painfully domestic, as if I had been replaced before I even knew the game had started. I walked past them, up to my room, and sat on the floor in the dark. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, finally accepting what I had refused to see for weeks. This wasn't just a temporary visit. This wasn't just a sister in need. This was a quiet invasion, and I was running out of space to hide. Some betrayals arrive with noise, slammed doors, shouted accusations, broken glass. Mine arrived in silence. It didn't knock, didn't announce itself, didn't scream for attention. It seeped into the walls like cold air, settling into the corners of my life until I could no longer ignore the chill. By the time it fully revealed itself, it wasn't a shock. It was confirmation. I had come home late that night, exhausted from a day that had tested every ounce of my patience. I remember the hallway light flickering as I unlocked the door, the familiar click of my heels against the hardwood, the way the house smelled like rosemary and wine. The lights were dimmed, soft music played in the background, and for a moment I thought I had walked into someone else's life. Then I saw them. I stood there, invisible, while they sat together in the living room. Her feet were curled beneath her, his arm draped casually across the back of the couch. A bottle of red wine sat open between them, half empty. They were laughing, low, intimate, as if they shared a private joke. My heart didn't race. It didn't even break. It just stopped. Not in shock, but in recognition. Like watching the final piece of a puzzle click into place and realizing the image was always exactly what you feared. I turned away without announcing myself. I didn't want to hear the excuses. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of being caught. I needed something they hadn't given me in months. Control. That night, I lay in bed replaying every moment, every brushed shoulder, every long glance, every shared whisper I had tried to ignore. It was all there. It had always been there. I had just been too tired, too hopeful, too committed to keeping the peace to name it. The next morning, nothing had changed on the surface. They moved around the house like nothing was wrong, like everything was normal. That was their specialty, creating chaos and pretending it didn't exist. I watched them closely, quietly, the way you observe a fire from a distance. You don't touch it, but you prepare the extinguisher. It was in the smallest things that the truth revealed itself. The way Mariana wore my perfume. The way Elias stopped including me in weekend plans. The way the mail started arriving in her name, even though she'd never changed her address. The way I began to feel like a guest in the place where I once felt safest. And then came the final push. There was a gathering at the house. Nothing special, just a dinner. Something to remind our parents that we were still a family, still close, still functioning. I cooked, I cleaned, I hosted, I tried. I performed the role they expected of me, even as I could feel something heavy gathering under the surface. She wore a dress that used to be mine, the one I had worn the night Elias proposed. She moved around the table like she belonged at the center of it. He hovered near her like gravity pulled him closer. When she stood to make her announcement, I already knew what was coming. Her voice was calm, sweet even, as she placed a hand over her stomach and revealed the news. My mother gasped. My father blinked in disbelief. Elias froze, as if time itself had betrayed him by allowing the moment to happen. But me? I didn't move. I watched the scene unfold like an actress who had read the script too many times. I knew every word, every reaction, every expression. It played out exactly as I had predicted. The joy, the confusion, the silence. Until she said it. It was his child. Those words rang out like a gunshot in a library. Sharp, impossible to ignore. The room became still, thick with judgment, with awkwardness, with lies. She turned to me, expecting a reaction, expecting pain, humiliation, outrage. I gave her none of it. I sat in absolute stillness, letting the moment sink into their skin instead of mine. I had no interest in performing pain for people who hadn't protected me, not anymore. Later that night, I walked the entire house alone. I touched the walls, the doorknobs, the furniture. I traced the life I had built, the memories I had poured into every surface. I stood in the garden Elias once promised to help me restore, now overgrown and wild. I realized I had been mourning the loss of this life long before Mariana made it official. What they didn't know was that I had already decided. The moment she opened her mouth, I began the process of reclaiming what was mine, not with screaming or tears, but with silence, strategy, and power. She may have carried his child. She may have taken his loyalty, but she didn't take what mattered most. Because the house, the very roof under which she plotted and played and postured, belonged to me. There's something terrifyingly peaceful about reaching the end of what you can tolerate. It's not a storm. It's not even a scream. It's quiet. Still. Like standing on the edge of a cliff and realizing the drop no longer scares you. Because the fall would, at the very least, be yours. Yours alone. That was what I felt the morning after the announcement. Not heartbreak, not rage, just stillness. It was the first time in months I didn't feel like I was spinning inside a life I couldn't control. I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't guessing. I wasn't trying to make excuses for anyone else's behavior. The truth was now laid out plainly, and I didn't need anyone to confirm it. Mariana was pregnant. Elias was the father. And I had been living with both of them while they built a future behind my back in the house I had fought to preserve. They had planned, lied, maneuvered, and smiled through it all. And still, they thought I would step aside. I moved through the house that morning with new eyes. Every item, every room, every faint smell of her perfume felt foreign now. What used to be home had become a stage for betrayal, and I was tired of playing the passive character in someone else's show. I had done everything right. I had loved, provided, supported, and protected. And for what? To be erased? Number. It wasn't about revenge, not in the way most people would think. I didn't want to hurt them. I wanted to restore myself. I wanted to peel away every piece of their presence until my home no longer held their shadows. I wanted silence without subtext, dinner without tension, mirrors that didn't reflect the woman they tried to reduce. For the first time in years, I pulled out the documents. The papers I'd stored away safely, quietly, without ever needing to wave them in anyone's face. The deed, the will, the notarized statements, my aunt's handwriting, still strong and deliberate, declaring me the sole heir of everything she had spent her life preserving. Her words were clear. This home belonged to me, in full, as recognition of the years I gave to her with patience, love, and loyalty. It was the kind of loyalty Mariana never understood. She had always mistaken kindness for weakness, as if empathy were something to exploit, not honor. Elias, too, had shown his true nature, not in the act itself, but in the way he let it fester. in the weeks, maybe months, of silence. The dismissals, the excuses, the slow erosion of intimacy he never thought I would notice. I noticed. I just chose, for far too long, not to believe what I saw. Now, belief didn't matter. Action did. I spent the next 2 days in motion, steady and calm. I researched legal procedures, made calls, asked questions. Every step I took was done in silence. I moved carefully, as if restoring order brick by brick. There was no need for confrontation. There would be no arguments. What they had built on dishonesty would crumble under facts. During those days, the energy in the house shifted again. Mariana walked lighter, laughed louder. She thought she had won, that I was slipping away in quiet defeat. Elias became strangely attentive, offering small acts of familiarity that now felt more like intrusion. I let them think what they wanted. I had stopped performing for their comfort. I was already elsewhere, preparing a life without them in it. I started collecting my personal things, not to leave, but to reclaim. Items they had borrowed without asking, clothes that had somehow ended up in her possession, gifts that had lost meaning. I boxed them with care, not because they mattered, but because ownership mattered. This wasn't about throwing anyone out. This was about drawing the line they thought I didn't have the strength to draw. Every night, I sat in the office where I used to plan renovations. I lit the same candle I had burned the day I first moved in. I listened to the creak of the floors and the wind outside, and I made peace with what was coming. The grief came in waves, not for them, but for me, for the version of myself that had believed I could love my way out of someone else's envy, for the woman who had made herself small for the comfort of people who never intended to protect her. Grief, I learned, doesn't always scream. Sometimes it's a quiet nod to the truth, a whispered farewell to the person you were before you knew what people were capable of. I didn't cry. I didn't rant. I just kept preparing. And when the paperwork was complete, the notices ready, and the legal path cleared, I looked around the house and felt something shift again. Not sadness, not anger, something closer to ownership, to presence. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't bracing for betrayal. I was ready to end it. Let them smile. Let them plan. Let them decorate the nursery she believed she'd raise her child in. They were planning a future in a house that didn't belong to them, and I was finally done protecting their illusion. There's a different kind of strength in silence, not the kind people expect, not the loud declarations, the confrontations, the public outbursts. Real strength, the kind that scares people the most, is the one that doesn't need to announce itself. It watches, it waits, and when it moves, it does so with precision. That was the strength I stepped into the morning I printed the eviction notices. The air felt colder than usual. The sunlight that poured through the windows didn't carry warmth. Everything looked the same but felt different, sharper, clearer, less forgiving. It was as if the house itself had been waiting for me to reclaim it. I had spent years filling this place with meaning. The furniture, the bookshelves, the faded family photos. They weren't just decoration. They were extensions of me. And yet, for months, I had allowed it all to be overshadowed, disrespected, overwritten, by two people who mistook my stillness for surrender. That ended now. The papers were simple, straightforward, a legal formality grounded in something they had forgotten: ownership. Not just emotional or symbolic, but documented, signed, notarized. My name, mine alone, on every page that mattered. My aunt had left it all to me. She knew, even before I did, what I would eventually need protection from. I had spoken to a lawyer, calm and composed. I asked every question, considered every scenario. I wasn't interested in a messy fallout. I wanted clean lines, firm boundaries, no loopholes. The notices were written clearly: 30 days to vacate, No arguments, no negotiation. As I folded each document and placed them into plain envelopes, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt focused, steady. This wasn't about revenge. This was about restoration, about stepping fully back into the space they had tried to steal from me. I rehearsed nothing. I didn't plan dramatic reveals. I wasn't going to scream or cry. I had already done enough of that in silence, behind closed doors, with no one there to see. What mattered now was execution. The house was still. They were out, shopping maybe, or pretending to be a normal couple preparing for a baby that had been conceived through betrayal. I walked through each room slowly, placing the envelopes in the exact places they'd find them. One on the kitchen counter, one outside the bedroom door. I made no attempt to hide them, no effort to soften the impact. The message didn't need decoration. It needed clarity. As I moved through the space, I took note of what had changed. The photos she had swapped without asking. The items he had left scattered carelessly, as if forgetting they weren't his to claim. I made mental lists, noted damages, logged details. I was methodical, detached. Emotions would only blur the edges, and I couldn't afford to lose focus now. For weeks, I had let them believe I was folding in on myself, that I would disappear, that I would make room for them, for their child, for their carefully manufactured future. But I wasn't disappearing. I was sharpening. There's a kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop trying to be loved by the wrong people, when you realize that protecting their comfort was never your job, that you can mourn the relationship and still protect yourself, that you can love someone once and still remove them from your life with finality. I didn't owe them kindness. I didn't owe them conversation. I didn't owe them anything. By the time they returned, I had already locked my bedroom door and drawn the curtains. I didn't need to see their faces when they found the envelopes. I didn't want to hear their footsteps pause or their breaths catch. I had no interest in their panic, their rage, their denial. Let them sit with it. Let them sit with the realization that the very foundation they had built their betrayal on wasn't theirs to stand on. The following days were tense, but I remained steady. They avoided me, whispered behind closed doors, paced hallways they no longer had permission to occupy. I made no attempt to explain myself. I cooked when I wanted to. I cleaned only after myself. I took long walks, worked from cafes, and answered questions only when absolutely necessary. They tried to act normal at first, tried to pretend the papers didn't change anything, but I could feel the shift in energy, the unraveling. The house had turned on them. The warmth was gone. The walls no longer welcomed them. The silence had weight now, and I no longer carried it alone. My parents called, confused and concerned. I told them only what was necessary. They asked questions I didn't answer, tried to guilt me, tried to reason, but this time, I didn't let their voices pull me back into the old role, the peacemaker, the bridge, the one who made things easier for everyone else. I had been easy for too long. Now, I was something else. In the final week before their deadline, I began reclaiming the home physically. I opened windows, aired out rooms. I took down anything that didn't reflect me. I deep cleaned the bathroom she'd overrun, restored the guest room to its original simplicity, moved furniture back into alignment. I replaced my old photo on the hallway wall, the one Mariana had buried in a drawer, and hung it proudly in the center again. It was my home, and I was done asking permission to live in it. There's a sacredness in watching a storm pass, knowing you didn't just survive it, you outlasted it. That's how I felt, standing in the doorway of my own home as the eviction date neared. Not victorious, just rooted, present, undeniably whole. Let them pack, let them scramble, let them cry, beg, twist, rewrite. The house no longer belonged to their story, and neither did I. There was no countdown, no dramatic exit, no shattered glass to mark the end. just a still morning and the subtle heaviness of closure pressing against the walls. I had marked the date in my mind like a ceremony, not to celebrate, but to remember. I wasn't waiting for them to leave. I was witnessing the end of something I had once called home. That day began like any other, but everything felt more fragile. The sunlight through the windows didn't linger. The air was thick with anticipation, not hope. Their 30 days were over. The eviction notice had matured. Legally, they had no ground left to stand on. Emotionally, I had no energy left to offer them. I heard the quiet shuffle of bags down the hallway, the soft thud of drawers closing for the last time. I didn't move from where I stood in the kitchen, letting the scent of coffee mask the bitterness I carried in my chest. There was no reason to watch them leave. I had already detached piece by piece, first emotionally, then mentally, and now physically. They moved like shadows, careful and tense. I could feel their presence in every creaking floorboard, every lingering pause before a door closed. The silence between us had become an invisible wall, and I had no intention of breaking it. As I sat by the window, watching the late summer light dance across the garden I used to tend, I remembered how Elias once helped me plant tulips there. We had laughed, made plans, promised things, promises that would rot in the same dirt he once touched with bare hands. Mariana had sat nearby that day, feigning indifference, pretending she had no interest in the life I was building. But she was always watching, always calculating. I just hadn't seen it then. Now, there was nothing left to misread. They left behind traces, of course. Forgotten chargers, a stained coffee mug, a pair of earrings that weren't mine. I collected the remnants like artifacts from a version of my life that no longer existed. Not with anger, but with deliberate care. I placed them in a box I didn't label, one I would store somewhere far from sight. Their departure didn't come with final words or apologies. It was fitting. Words had always been their tools, to distract, confuse, manipulate. In the end, they left the same way they had moved through my life, silently rewriting the narrative and assuming I would clean up the aftermath. But this time, the story ended on my terms. When the front door closed for the final time, I waited a full hour before I moved. Not because I was afraid they'd return, but because I needed that silence to settle into the floors again. I needed to feel the house exhale with me. It had been holding its breath for too long. I walked through every room slowly, as if reacquainting myself with an old friend. The spaces they had touched now felt suspended, furniture left slightly out of place, walls that still carried the faint warmth of their presence. But it would fade. I would scrub it out, repaint, rearrange, reclaim. Upstairs, the bedroom they had shared was already stripped bare. The mattress was uncovered, the closet half open, one hanger still swinging from its rod. I didn't linger. I opened the windows wide, letting the air sweep through with a force that felt like a purge. I gathered the last remaining things, not with urgency, but with finality. By evening, the house was quiet in a way it hadn't been in months. No footsteps above me, no whispered voices behind doors, no perfume bleeding through the air vents. Just silence. Sacred, earned silence. That night, I didn't celebrate. I didn't light candles or pour wine. I simply lay in bed and listened to the creak of the walls, the hum of the night, the gentle confirmation that I was finally alone and safe. It wasn't joy I felt. It was something heavier, but cleaner. The weight of survival. The beginning of repair. I didn't sleep much. My body was still adjusting to peace, mistrusting it. I woke several times just to listen, just to make sure. Each time the silence greeted me like a promise kept. The next morning, I opened every curtain. I let light flood the rooms they had darkened. I put on music I used to love, let it echo through the house like a revival. I made breakfast and sat in the kitchen chair I had avoided for weeks. I poured my coffee without watching over my shoulder. The house was mine again, not because they were gone, but because I had taken it back. And as I sat in the living room, staring at the spot where they had once made their announcement, that moment that changed everything, I didn't feel bitterness. I felt relief. It was over, and I had survived it. In the days that followed their departure, the silence in the house began to settle differently. It no longer felt hollow. It felt earned. A quiet that belonged to me, not born from absence but created by intention. For the first time in months, I could hear my own thoughts clearly, no longer distorted by the tension that had taken root like mold behind the drywall. But peace, I was learning, often comes with a price, especially when it offends those who benefited from your suffering. It didn't take long for the first messages to arrive. Missed calls, vague texts, sudden concern from family members who had been distant when I needed them most. The same people who ignored the subtle cruelties, the shifting dynamics, the emotional erosion, now wanted explanations. I didn't respond. I wasn't ready to defend myself for choosing not to be betrayed twice. I had nothing to justify. I had told the truth through actions, and still, I could feel their disappointment forming like clouds in the distance. They weren't angry that I had been hurt. They were uncomfortable that I had handled it so cleanly, that I hadn't exploded, screamed, or played the victim, that I had ended it on my terms. Some people only recognize pain when it's loud. My mother's voice finally cracked through the silence with a voicemail I didn't ask for. Her tone was wrapped in confusion and disappointment, as though she couldn't quite understand how her daughters had fallen apart. She didn't ask how I was. She asked how Mariana was handling it, as if the real tragedy was the discomfort of the one who broke the foundation. I sat with that message for a long time, not because it hurt, but because it didn't surprise me. It confirmed what I had always known deep down. I had been raised to carry the burden quietly, to maintain the illusion of peace, even when it came at the cost of my own dignity. This time I had chosen differently, and that, more than the betrayal itself, made people uncomfortable. Elias reached out too, a short, sterile email that danced around the truth like he always had. He spoke in vague terms, misunderstandings, miscommunications, regrets. But he didn't ask to come back. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He asked for understanding. That was all I needed to see how little he had changed. There were no lawsuits, no legal pushback. The house was mine, indisputably. But the social consequences moved in more quietly. Invitations stopped arriving. The cousins who once texted me weekly now watched my stories silently, never responding. Family events happened without mention. I wasn't exiled loudly. I was erased quietly. And yet, I felt more whole than I had in years. Without their voices crowding my mind, I began to rebuild parts of myself I had lost, not just in the months they lived with me, but in all the years I had shaped myself around other people's comfort. I repainted the walls of the bedroom, not because I had to, but because I wanted to watch the color of that chapter disappear. I replaced the mattress. I donated the furniture they had used. I cleaned every inch of the house until it smelled like lemon and eucalyptus and healing. I created new rituals. Saturday mornings became silent, sacred. I lit candles again, without worrying someone would blow them out, for safety. I cooked meals that took hours, not because anyone was coming, but because I wanted to feed myself slowly. I stopped checking my phone as often. I planted new flowers in the garden, not tulips, not reminders, wildflowers, things that didn't need permission to grow where they pleased. The neighborhood began to feel warm again, familiar. People waved. The woman down the street asked if I'd been traveling. I smiled and simply said I'd been busy. I didn't owe anyone the full story. I had lived it, and that was enough. Of course, there were moments that hurt, random memories that surfaced uninvited. The smell of a dish she used to cook, the sound of a laugh that once felt safe. But I didn't push them away. I let them move through me. Pain, I was learning, doesn't demand destruction. Sometimes it just asks to be acknowledged and then released. I didn't respond to Mariana. Not once. She tried twice. A message and a letter. Both framed herself as misunderstood. She still didn't know how to exist outside of the role she had created, the one who takes, apologizes, then returns. But I was no longer participating in that story. Her chapter in my life was closed. Her silence after the betrayal had been louder than any apology she could offer now. Letting go wasn't a single decision. It was daily. It was in every small choice, to not rehash, to not reply, to not reopen the door. It was in every morning I woke up without wondering what they were saying behind it. I had reclaimed the house, yes. But more than that, I had reclaimed myself. And that was something no one would be able to take again. Not with charm, not with tears, not with blood ties. Some families are built on loyalty. Others are held together by silence, denial, and roles we never chose. I had finally stepped out of mine, and in that space, for the first time in my adult life, I was free. I always thought healing would feel like light breaking through clouds. Sudden, obvious. A moment when the pain just lifts, like fog rolling off the hills. But it didn't come like that. It came in layers. It came in silence. It came in learning how to breathe again without bracing for disappointment. The first thing I noticed after they were gone was how quiet grief could be. Not the grief of losing them. I had already grieved those relationships long before they left. What lingered was the grief for myself, for the woman who had built a home with such hope, for the version of me who had once imagined a life with people who never really saw her. I had to relearn how to live without their noise. At first, it felt strange to wake up and hear nothing but birds. No doors slamming, no distant laughter meant to exclude, no low voices behind walls whispering things I'd never be allowed to ask about. I would lie in bed and just listen, not for anything in particular, just to remind myself that I was alone and safe. It took time to stop flinching at kindness. When a neighbor brought over cookies, I questioned her motive. When a coworker complimented my hair, I wondered what she wanted. I had become so conditioned to expect manipulation wrapped in politeness that I struggled to trust even the smallest gestures. I didn't realize how deeply betrayal rewires you, how it turns love into something you second-guess. But I was patient with myself. I didn't force healing into a schedule. I let it happen the way storms end, slowly, with soft light and puddles left behind. Some mornings, I would sit on the porch with a cup of tea and just watch the wind move through the trees. I had nowhere to be, no one to perform for. That quiet, aimless presence became my sanctuary. I started writing again. Not stories, not essays, just thoughts. Fragments of memory. Sentences that carried weight. Words I hadn't spoken aloud for years. I filled pages with feelings I had never dared to express, not even to myself. The journal became a mirror I could finally face. It didn't judge me. It didn't ask me to get over it. It just held what I needed to release. Some days were harder than others. I would walk past a mirror and barely recognize myself. I had aged more in the last year than I had in the 5 before it. Not in wrinkles or gray hairs, but in stillness. In the way I carried myself. Like someone who had learned to be her own witness. Someone who no longer asked others to validate her pain. I didn't reach out to new people right away. I didn't force a social life back into existence. I needed to be alone, not out of fear, but out of necessity. Solitude became a kind of medicine. I went to movies by myself, took long drives without a destination, spent entire weekends without speaking to anyone. I wasn't lonely. I was repairing. The house began to reflect that change. I rearranged the furniture, not just to fill space, but to shift energy. I painted the walls in colors that felt like peace. I gave away anything that reminded me of them, even if it was beautiful. I learned that beauty, when tied to pain, is just another form of grief. I began walking every morning, just before sunrise. It started as a way to ease the restlessness in my body, but it became something more. I would watch the sky shift from navy to gold, and for those few minutes I felt untouched by anything that had happened. Nature doesn't care about betrayal. The world keeps turning, and in its turning, I found comfort. Eventually, I let people back in. Not many, just enough. A former classmate I ran into at the farmer's market. A quiet woman from my yoga class who never asked too many questions. We met for coffee, for short walks, for gentle conversation. I didn't tell them everything. I didn't need to. They accepted the version of me that survived. That was enough. What surprised me most was how much I liked my own company. I used to think I needed other people to feel real, that my worth was tied to who accepted me, who stayed, who chose me. But now I knew better. I wasn't meant to be chosen by people who couldn't honor me. I was meant to choose myself, fully, daily, unapologetically. I stopped checking social media. I didn't need to know how they were doing, whether they missed me, regretted anything, or told lies about what happened. Their silence was no longer a weapon. It was a wall I welcomed. Let them build their life out of denial. I was building mine from truth. One night, months after they left, I stood in the hallway outside the bedroom and just stared. That room had once been the site of so much pain. The stolen conversations, the shared glances, the final betrayal. But now, it was empty. Clean. Quiet. I stepped inside, ran my fingers along the windowsill, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was still holding. This was my life now. Mine. Not perfect. Not always joyful. But real. And finally, enough. Before I tell you how it all ends, let me say this. If you've ever been pushed to the edge by the very people who were supposed to protect you, if you've ever stood alone in the ruins of a life someone else tried to steal, then you already know. Healing isn't quiet and it isn't quick, but it's yours. Every tear, every boundary, every breath you reclaim, it's yours. So if this story spoke to something deep in you, if you saw even a sliver of your own struggle in mine, please take a second to support this channel. Click like, subscribe, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. And remember, your voice matters. You are not invisible. You are not alone. Now, let me tell you what happened when I stopped surviving and started becoming someone new. The day I realized I was no longer angry caught me by surprise. It wasn't dramatic. There was no epiphany, no flash of forgiveness or final closure. It was just a quiet morning, the kind that used to feel like nothing, and that now felt like everything. I was sitting by the window, coffee in hand, watching the garden breathe in early light. And I felt still. Not because I had forgotten, but because I had finally stopped holding it all. There was no more need to rehearse what I would say if I ran into them again. No more imaginary conversations where I told them everything they never bothered to ask. I no longer wanted revenge. I no longer wanted their understanding. I didn't even want their guilt. I just wanted distance and peace, and I had both. The legal part had long been settled. They left quietly, as I knew they would. The silence between us stretched like a canyon, and I let it widen. I didn't respond to the messages that trickled in from extended family, the ones who couldn't believe what happened, who wanted me to make peace, not because they cared about my healing, but because they hated discomfort. I stopped explaining myself. That was the most liberating part. I didn't owe anyone a version of the story that made them feel better about watching it happen. Instead, I started building something. Not just a life, a self. A self I had spent too long postponing. I enrolled in a course I had always told myself I didn't have time for. Interior design. The irony didn't escape me. I had poured years into making my home beautiful, warm, lived in, only to have it temporarily overtaken by people who didn't respect it. Now, I wanted to take that instinct and make something of it. Not just restore spaces, but restore meaning. I wanted to help people feel at home, in their homes, something I had once lost and had to reclaim piece by piece. It wasn't easy. Starting over never is. I had to unlearn habits of shrinking, habits of pleasing. I had to fight the urge to apologize for taking up space, even when I was alone in a room. I caught myself writing emails with too many softeners. Just wondering if, or sorry to bother, and I deleted them, rewriting each message with clarity and certainty. My body began to change too. Not in size or shape, but in posture. I stood straighter, walked slower, took up space deliberately. I began dressing for myself again, not to prove anything, not to win back a version of myself that belonged to anyone else, just to feel honest in my own skin. I let my phone stay on silent. I removed Mariana from every contact list, blocked her from every app, not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. I didn't need a window into her life. Whatever story she was telling, to herself or to others, it was no longer mine to correct. Sometimes I still imagined what kind of mother she might become, whether she'd be soft, whether she'd tell the truth one day, whether the child would grow up to ask hard questions. But those thoughts faded quickly, not because they didn't matter, but because they weren't mine to carry. Her future was no longer my concern. I had finally returned to my own. The house became something new too. Not a reminder, not a wound, but a sanctuary again. I took down the last traces of the life I once shared with Elias, gave away the gifts, changed the bedding, bought new dinnerware. Nothing fancy, just mine. One afternoon, I painted the front door a deep teal, bold and unexpected. It made the house feel like it was exhaling, like it had waited patiently for its heartbeat to return. For weeks afterward, I'd catch myself smiling every time I saw that color. A small, silent declaration that the story had changed. There were nights when the loneliness came back, not the longing for them, but for who I was before them. For the soft-hearted version of me that hadn't learned to guard so fiercely. I missed her. I still do. But I also know she couldn't have survived what I did. She had to become me to make it through, and I honor her every day by living, fully, quietly, with strength no one gets to question anymore. Now, when I tell this story, when I share it here, with you, it's not to reopen the wound. It's to mark the scar, to show you that it closed, that it healed, that you can rebuild what others tried to burn down, that your life, no matter how derailed it's been, still belongs to you. And if you're standing where I once stood, at the edge of betrayal, surrounded by silence, wondering if it's worth fighting for yourself, let me be the voice that says yes. Yes, it is. Because you are.